So I'm delighted this year to welcome Max Stearns, who, like Michael Saltzman in his presentation, is no guest of Betham. He is a member of Betham for many years now. He and his family have been connected here, and his 3 children grew up here. His wife Vered as well, an important part of this community. When I sort of envisioned this at the break thing years ago, and it's nice to come back to it now, I thought, you know what? Some people want to take a walk around the lake, and some people want to take a nap, and some people, they're just here all day, and it's nice to have something for people to do and some time to learn. And so I made it a point of trying to recruit people who were not Jewish to come and speak during this time, because they're not fasting, so they might actually be coherent. And we had some amazing people over the years, right? We had a couple of Episcopal priests come and speak. We had Kol and Aisha from Dovecote Cafe speak. We had a Christian Palestinian diplomat from the state of Israel come and speak. We've had some really fascinating things. And this year, I was so dismayed by the recent session of the Supreme Court. I thought, I feel like we need to hear something more about what this all means for us as a Jewish community, for questions of religion and state. And I couldn't think of anyone better to do this than Max Stearns, who's a con law professor. And so I called Max and said, I know Yom Kippur afternoon is not the time that you probably want to be doing something, but I think this could be very powerful if you're willing. And turnabout's fair play. Max says, sure, I'll do it, but then you have to do a thing with me and we can have a conversation. So here we are, 2 guys, I don't know how many hours into our fast, but we're going to try to be coherent. So here's a little about Max. He is the venerable, how do you pronounce the second word? Becher, and Howard Professor of Law at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. During his 3-decade career teaching constitutional law and economic analysis of law, Max has employed tools of economic analysis to better understand Supreme Court doctrines and decision-making processes. Over the past 2 years, Max has been writing a book that addresses the crisis facing our democracy and how to fix it. Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy, is due to be published in early 2024. Max is going to begin with some opening remarks. Then I'm going to sit in conversation with him, and then we'll open it up for some questions, reflections from all of you. So for now, we'll turn to Max.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and I'll do my best to be as incoherent as I possibly can be. So I captioned this from divine to secular judgment, reflecting on how the changing Supreme Court affects our community. So thank you, everybody, for allowing me to speak as we contemplate a shift from divine judgment respecting each of us to considering our own personal judgments about the Supreme Court in a period of in a period of dramatic transition. As I suspect many of you might know, Chief Justice Roberts recently pushed back against suggestions that a series of notable Supreme Court rulings affecting significant changes to longstanding doctrine have diminished the court's legitimacy. There's a split in how people understand the word legitimacy, and I just want to reflect on it for a moment. Legitimacy sometimes means the power of an institution to act. But it also connotes perceptions about the moral rightness or acceptability of institutional actions based on how we view the decision-making processes. I suspect very few people have doubts about the Supreme Court's legitimacy in the first sense, just the raw power. But I believe a growing number of people have it in the second sense, as to the sort of its moral authority. As Rabbi Berg mentioned, I've spent the last couple of years writing a book, we can talk about the whole agent experience, that addresses my concerns shared by a vast number of citizens, academics, and news commentators that our democracy is in crisis. I discussed the root causes of the crisis and what I believe we must do to extricate ourselves from it. But that's not the central focus of this conversation, although it is related. The Supreme Court has several cameos in that book, but it has no lead part. The court has not helped our democratic institutions thrive, and it has contributed to undermining their functioning in particular ways. But ultimately, the court cannot save our democracy. That task falls to all of us. So I'm going to do my best to keep these remarks relatively brief so the rabbi and I can engage those wishing to do so in conversation. Providing an overview of what's happening on the Supreme Court in 15 to 17 minutes may not rise to the challenge that Rabbi Hillel faced when asked to explain all of Judaism while standing on one foot, but it's a challenge, especially because I'm not nearly as pithy, apparently, as Rabbi Hillel. One obviously relevant area to our congregation involves cases arising under the First Amendment's two religion clauses, the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. Recent cases garnering public attention include allowing a high school football coach to engage in on-the-field prayer with some dispute as to student involvement immediately following the game. That was Kennedy versus Bremerton High School, Bremerton School District this past term. Another involves striking a state of Maine policy that disallowed tax credits benefiting parents choosing to send their children to sectarian schools. That was Carson versus Macon, also past term. Last year, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against Philadelphia's refusal to contract with a Christian foster care agency that refused to place children with same-sex couples. That case was Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. Most recently, the Supreme Court declined to stay a lower court order mandating that Yeshiva University recognize an LGBTQ group, although that ruling was quite narrow and procedural, and it's possible that that case may head back up to the court at some point. Yeshiva responded to that decision by shutting down all student organizational activity. The strategy is sadly familiar to those like me who study constitutional law for a living, and it's not a very good look. After Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which formally, although not actually, ended state-mandated race-based segregation, affected jurisdictions responded in a variety of ways. One shut down its public schools rather than allowing them to be integrated, to which the Supreme Court said no. That was a case called Griffin versus County School Board in 1964. Another took this approach not for its schools but for its rec facilities, including a municipal swimming pool, to which the Supreme Court said yes in a case called Watson versus Memphis. And you might think that that implies that schools are more important than pools, but across many African American communities, children simply didn't learn how to swim as pool access became increasingly privatized, putting these children and later as adults in vital danger. And it's notable that there's a specific halachic tradition, if not quite command, demanding that we teach our children how to swim, which the rabbi was kind to give me the side on, Talmud Kiddushin 29a. So let me return to the First Amendment in just a few minutes. The opinion that's undoubtedly captured the greatest public attention over the last several months, from when it was first leaked to Politico and then formally published in June of this year, is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Center. And Dobbs overturned the near 50-year-old precedent Roe versus Wade from 1973, finding that women have a fundamental right to terminate unwanted pregnancies subject to specified limitations. Roe was later modified in the 1992 decision, Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey, a case which Dobbs also overruled. Dobbs has led many constitutional scholars, myself included, to speculate about other areas of established precedent that might soon be on the chopping block. Among the notable contenders are possibly ending the permissibility of race-based affirmative action programs in institutions of higher learning, which the Supreme Court reaffirmed in Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, subject to limitations in Gratz versus Bollinger, also decided on the same day, and possibly reconsidering the right to same-sex marriage recognized in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015. I should add that in Grutter, Justice O'Connor herself itself claimed to sunset affirmative action in 2028, which is really, really odd, and which is also really, really approaching, although it's possible it will come as soon as this term. We'll see. One more, the court might again reconsider part of the Voting Rights Act with the effect of letting states re-engage with racial gerrymandering. If we go a bit further back than the most recent terms, the Supreme Court fundamentally transformed Second Amendment jurisprudence. First in 2008, announcing that the amendment, the Second Amendment, protects an individual right, and that's the case D.C. v. Heller. And then 2 years later, in 2010, it applied that ruling to states and local governments in McDonald versus Chicago. This past term, in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the court held that the Second Amendment protects the right to carry concealed weapons without having to show proper cause. I'll mention one more ruling that garnered less public attention but is singularly important and that I wish everybody knew from 2019, and that's Rucho versus Common Cause. And there the Supreme Court abandoned an admittedly tortured body of case law spanning back several decades. Several earlier cases suggested possible equal protection limits on the ability of state general assemblies to engage in what's referred to as hyperpartisan gerrymandering of congressional districts. The principal effect of this form of gerrymandering is that few to none of our congressional elections today are competitive, or at least they're not competitive in the general election. They're often competitive in the primary caucus cycle. But that competitiveness makes our blue states bluer and our red states redder. As I say in my book, although young children tend to love the color purple, for some reason the Supreme Court apparently does not. Rucho interacts in troubling ways with another famous case that got more attention from 2010, Citizens United versus FEC, the Federal Election Commission, which allows near limitless corporate campaign expenditures and rests on the questionable proposition that corporations hold First Amendment rights to free expression akin to those of flesh and blood human beings. All right, so let's now return to religion. As I suspect most of you know, the Free Exercise Clause is designed to ensure that even religious minorities, such as those of us who are Jewish or Muslim in a country that's predominantly Christian, may exercise freedom of conscience and may engage, unless there's a strong reason to prevent it, in associated rituals. The Establishment Clause has been interpreted to disallow the government, federal or state, from formally establishing a particular religion, but its significance is broader than that. It's been construed to prevent states from engaging in activities that endorse particular religious faiths in ways that diminish others or those who are a-religious. Although these two clauses are not inevitably or inexorably in tension, they're at least potentially in tension. The relationship's complicated, and in the world of memes, I've noticed that it can sometimes get distorted in the public imagination. As one example, as I've seen on social media posts claiming that if my religion allows terminating an unwanted pregnancy, Dobbs, which lets states ban abortions entirely, infringes upon my free exercise rights. Now, I want to be clear that that intuition is mistaken. Abortions are not a religious right among adherents to faiths that treat it more liberally, say, than conservative Christian communities, especially those that regard life as starting at conception, for example, based on the Catholic religious doctrine of ensoulment. And this includes Judaism, which undeniably elevates the concern for the mother's health and well-being over that of the unborn child. But more generally, laws routinely prohibit activities that are the subject of moral and religious condemnation, categories that inevitably overlap. As an obvious example, almost all religions proscribe rape and murder, and that doesn't mean that state laws criminalizing either violate either the Establishment or Free Exercise Clauses. Now, as I do when I teach my class, I'm going to let you know that what I'm about to say is my opinion. I believe that to the extent that there's a tension between the First Amendment to religion clauses, the Jewish community has historically done better by emphasizing concerns about the Establishment Clause more so than the Free Exercise Clause. Why? When we have prayer in public school or on a football field, tax subsidies benefiting religious schools, or other public policies benefiting practitioners of any particular faith, all of which implicates the Establishment Clause, as members of a religious minority, our community is threatened. We are othered in ways that risk discrimination and acts of hatred. The danger, which feeds anti-Semitic tropes, becomes more pervasive and threatening the more we're seen as thwarting accepted norms, yet otherwise thriving as a community. Now, when I speak in areas that brush up against the outer boundaries of my limited areas of expertise, I often invite others with the relevant expertise to share their views. And in this case, I benefited from some helpful insights from a colleague of mine, Professor Richard Bolt, and also from a rabbi who's my first cousin, Rabbi Dan Walpe, and of course, our own Rabbi Berg. In an earlier draft of this talk, I claimed that our religious tradition is generally more comfortable drawing boundary lines that separate our religious life from other domains. That was obviously overstated, and certainly for religious schools, halacha touches on all aspects of our life. The rabbi last night conveyed this point humorously, where he said, although some of us will have trouble thinking about prayer while we're doing our work, we seem to have a little less trouble thinking about our work in shul, guilty as charged. Nonetheless, I believe I can make the point in a somewhat more subtle way. For a combination of reasons, Jews are generally more accepting of a kind of compartmentalization. This might stem from the diaspora tradition of respecting secular law in nations where Jews reside. It might relate to, and we just talked about this, our view of proselytization, not seeking new adherents from outside the community. And perhaps it's because outside the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi communities, Jews tend to be less certain or less dogmatic as to what Judaism compels. I particularly like Rabbi Berg's formulation that Jews seem generally comfortable in willingly embracing contradictory truths. But however one frames it, I believe there's an important difference in worldview between our religion and adherence to certain Christian evangelical faiths. For the fundamentalist evangelical teacher, infringing on her or his ability to have public school prayer in a classroom or on a football field violates free exercise, just as the same activities infringe on our right to avoid religious establishment or entanglement. When the First Amendment doctrine articulates the proposition that states may impose neutral laws that have an incidental burden on religious practice, that generally comports fairly well with the Jewish worldview. But it simply fares less well with the worldview of evangelical Christians. And as Jews, we need to understand this. An important aspect of the football case is that the majority, with Justice Gorsuch writing, treats it as implicating free exercise by the coach who wishes to quietly and privately pray. Those challenging it, by contrast, treat the prayer as an unlawful entanglement with religion in violation of the Establishment Clause. This divergence is not coincidental, and it can be extended to other religion cases, including those that I've mentioned. The court has increasingly moved toward treating religion as a category, like race or gender, that in specific contexts cannot be treated differently in the sense of being discriminated against. But the flip side always is that preserving a public right to free exercise invariably runs up against Establishment Clause claims by those who do not wish to be ostracized, but who also don't wish to be coercively involved or othered for failing to do so. The dispute in the football case is not symbolic, it's real. I don't mean to imply these dynamics can ever be reversed for members of the Jewish community. Some see this in the recent yeshiva case, where the university administrators claim that the obligation to acquiesce in accommodating a student group infringes on their free exercise right. But here's the thing. Recent Supreme Court developments are, in my view, harming the Jewish community by contributing to a wedge between many, perhaps most members of the ultra-Orthodox communities of Haredi, along with some who share their ideological leanings on one side, and more secular Jews, including members of faith communities like ours, on the other. And this is incredibly dangerous, and it's the sort of thing that we experienced when there was a divided reaction, for example, to Donald Trump's recognition of Israel as Jerusalem's capital, which was followed by his condemnatory comments about us Jews who, in his view, were not adequately grateful for his having made that decision. And this is sort of a persistent pattern of driving a kind of wedge among members of our community, broadly defined. Personally, I think Yeshiva got this wrong, both on the law and in the broader sense that of what helps us as a Jewish community. Allowing a student group authorized by the First Amendment isn't an endorsement of that group's views or any particular private activity of its members. So I suspect I've opened up more questions perhaps than answers. Of course, it is Yom Kippur. When I was chatting with the rabbi about this, I said I didn't want to convey that I'd be issuing my personal judgment on the Supreme Court. Somehow that seemed inappropriate to me. Instead, I want to invite a conversation. Thank you for letting me offer some remarks, and I look forward to whatever comments or questions folks have.
So I think I'm going to start with a couple of questions, then we'll open it up. So I think I want to kind of zoom out a little bit from the particulars of what is sort of legally acceptable within, like, Supreme Court jurisprudence, and talk a little bit about us as Jews or as communities of faith in the United States. And you talked about these two aspects of the First Amendment that are kind of naturally in tension with one another. I gave a sermon after the Kennedy v. Bremerton case where I expressed my own view that what I see as the erosion of the wall of separation between church and state, I mean, even saying church and state already, I guess, is kind of ceding a point that maybe we shouldn't cede, right? But between religion and state, was in no uncertain terms bad for the Jews. And you touched on this, Max, in saying that your feeling, if I heard you right, is that our focus on the Establishment Clause is important because it's not good for us or other minority religious faiths, or for that matter, people who are not religious at all, when one religion can impose itself on others. But I think that's exactly what we're seeing more and more, and we're not seeing it just in school systems where there's a majority of Christian students, or maybe a majority of evangelical or Catholic Christian students who subscribe to certain beliefs. But what we're seeing is minority in views imposed on really an unwitting majority of the country, right? So the Dobbs case that you referred to, most people in America are in favor of at least some measure of abortion access, and the Supreme Court seems to be in a different place. And I think that's also true for school prayer, and it seems also true for the school funding issue that you touched on in Macon. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the rise of Christian nationalism and how it has affected the law and the courts. Yes, Justice Sotomayor is also Catholic, and that's important for us to remember, but the 6 justices who ruled in Dobbs or who ruled in Kennedy or in some of these other cases are clearly not in the same place as most Americans, or what I view would be good for the Jewish people. So I'm curious if you could speak about that phenomenon and what do you think it means for us?
Yeah, I agree with your observations, obviously, and I think you're right. I think that it is mistaken to imagine. Is this on? Okay. I think it's mistaken to imagine that this is something that these moves are universally embraced by the Christian community writ large. I think, and I hope I didn't convey that impression, which is one of the reasons I was careful to speak in terms of evangelical faith, that has as a fundamental core element really an inability to distinguish public and private life, and regarding proselytization as something that is incumbent as a religious obligation, which is not part of our tradition. I do think that the Supreme Court is out of keeping with general sentiment. Certainly in abortion, there's no doubt. There's Pew Research data on that. The court is an outlier. The Texas case is particularly egregious. The Texas law, which is a form of vigilante justice, is particularly egregious. It's simply, just hard to reconcile that with any long-standing American jurisprudential traditions. Now, granted, the Supreme Court hasn't given a formal approval of that, but one of the legitimacy concerns here is sort of allowing these things to occur without needing to do it because other institutional actors are doing it in the court's place. And you talked about the composition of the court. It's obviously people are aware of the fact that one of the factors that contributes to concerns about the court's legitimacy is the contrived Merrick Garland rule that was immediately contradicted at the absolute very first opportunity by the very people who said, hold me to this, I promise I will be bound by it. Which, that does give rise to concerns about institutional legitimacy that I think Robert's admonition, oh, no, you shouldn't, the fact that we've issued controversial decisions should not undermine our legitimacy. I think that is a proposition that's going to just be hard to continue to sustain. But I agree with you, and I do want to emphasize that I think you're right, that a lot of Christians, a lot of Protestants, a lot of Muslims are, right there with members of the community here that would regard the Bremerton case or the Carson v. Macon case as being a move in the direction of, if not establishment of religion, entanglement with religion in ways that runs the risk of othering highly vulnerable people. And students are vulnerable. The idea that students have a choice to join on the field after the game or not is, in order to be able to claim that, you have to have been severely removed from the peer pressure of a public education or any educational environment. Pressure is enormous on adolescents and on children in general, and that's the whole notion of the Lemon Test concept of entanglement, which is something that Gorsuch obviously is not liking very much, and may have enough votes eventually to begin to erode that to the point where that is no longer, no longer as much a part of the First Amendment jurisprudence as it long was.
Well, and I mean, in that opinion, right, didn't Justice Gorsuch, I mean, even the story he was telling about what happened on that football field, like the fact that Justice Sotomayor had to attach photographs to her dissent to say, hey, look, there were people there were cameras there, right? This wasn't like some guy on a mountaintop meditating to his God, right? Like, well, this was clearly...
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's so strange about that opinion, that juxtaposition of those two opinions is, ordinarily, you might have some disagreements about inferences to draw from the facts that are on the ground. Rarely will you have such fundamental disagreements about the facts on the ground, literal facts on the ground. Yeah. And you read the majority opinion, and then you think, oh, well, yeah, this is a quirky, maybe a quirky behavior or not, but nobody's joining him, he's doing it on his own. And then you realize, no, wait a minute. He changed the protocol for the prayer the last 3 games. Prior to that, he had been disciplined and told, in effect, you can't do it in a way that's coercive to students. Then comes out with this other way of doing it, and apparently some of the players from the other team joined on the field. It's not clear whether some of the members of his own team did. Part of legitimacy is assuming that you're being told the facts in a fair and dispassionate way. It's okay for justices to have agreement disagreements, even intense disagreements, about the implications to draw from facts. It is not okay for justices to manipulate the presentation of facts. That's just not okay, and really isn't part of our tradition, so yeah.
All right, so I want to ask one more question of you, if that's all right, and then I want to open it up to others. And it really speaks to this question, perhaps, of legitimacy, because of course, you know, where's the check, right? where's the fact checking if justices can sort of tell whatever story they want, and that becomes the law of the land? I like to, you know, I'm a rabbi, obviously not a lawyer, not a judge, not a con law professor, but I try to stay informed, and one of the ways I do is I listen to Dahlia Lithwick's Amicus podcast, which I think is terrific. And she was recently discussing her new book, Lady Justice, and a question came up which I thought was fascinating, and it was about the relationship between working within a broken system or speaking and acting from beyond the constraints of that system. And she was talking about how she was able to kind of speak from beyond it, just given the platform that she has in her podcast and her writing in Slate. And she's been able to cover a number of different things, including the trial recently of what happened in, why am I forgetting now? The white nationalist Nazi march in Charlottesville. It is late in the day and I am fasting. I got it though. So I guess I wanted to kind of come back to this question of legitimacy. And you seem to be someone who feels that, I don't know if it's the system is worth defending, the court is worth defending, or the United States system of government is worth defending, and that's why the Supreme Court plays, as you say, a cameo role in the book, but not a lead role. But can you speak to this question of kind of working within the system versus questioning whether it's fundamentally broken and beyond repair? And why do you see it as not fundamentally beyond repair?
Oh, no, I think it's fundamentally broken. That's been the last 2 years of my life, actually, is writing a book explaining that our system is fundamentally broken. We are in my view, really the third constitutional crisis, if we can count ridding ourselves of the Articles and the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction as the first two. This is no less serious than that. We have a fundamental set of structural impediments to effective governance in this country. I mean, so I hope I didn't suggest something Pollyannish, because I assure you I wouldn't have spent the last 2 years writing a book if I didn't think that we were in the midst of something severe, and I do think we're in the midst of something severe. The reason why the Supreme Court gets only cameos as opposed to a lead part is because the Supreme Court's symptomatic of the fundamental breakdown of our democratic norms. It's not the cause of them. It exacerbates the breakdown of our democratic norms. For example, it would be helpful, even if they never found a clear example of an unconstitutional gerrymander, to at least know that that possibility is out there as a potential check on more egregious behavior by state legislative bodies. Just yesterday, we had oral argument in a case not involving partisan gerrymandering, but racial gerrymandering. We may see we've already seen one major part of the Voting Rights Act basically abandoned, and we're about to possibly see the second part, major part of the Voting Rights Act. So administrative preclearance has basically been abandoned based on this notion of equal sovereignty that the Supreme Court made up in the very case. And now we may see abandon the notion of non-retrogression, meaning making sure that we don't diminish the representation of African American voting strength as it's reflected in congressional delegations. But I do not think, even as I am highly critical of a number of Supreme Court cases that have exacerbated the difficult functioning of our system, the flip side is also true. I am certain that the Supreme Court cannot fix it, that the fix has to come politically. And I've reached a point where, and this is why I'm writing a book, I mean, I'm quite convinced that it cannot be done at the margins, that we need a fundamental restructuring of our electoral system if we are to remain a democracy. I'm convinced of that. And that's why the subtitle of my book is The Least Radical Means of Radically Repairing Our Broken Democracy. I know what I'm saying is radical, but I also think it's least radical. These are not times for the timid, and neither were the first two constitutional crises, right? So I think we have to really boldly recognize the problems that we face. We've got two parties that are moving increasingly far apart. You can actually go on the Pew website and you can find a cartoon image that will show you once overlapping parties in the 90s that are just moving further and further apart. And you can identify the dysfunction that gives rise to when a small faction in a party can take over that party and actually have a realistic shot at having control of the government. And of course, we're all familiar with what happened on January 6th. You know, so I'll recommend, I'll recommend a book, I guess. And then I recommend mine, but mine's not going to be out until 2024. But you should read the Ziblatt Levitsky book, How Democracies Die, because the central lesson of that book is poignant. And it's that a lot of us think that democracies die with some major military coup, but no. Democracies historically die through the gradual erosion of democratic norms. And once they begin to erode piece by piece, people accept that the norms have eroded and regard as normal things that prior to the erosion of those norms were never regarded as normal. And I regard that as really descriptive. I'm observing it, and I've been teaching constitutional law. It shocks me to say it. This is my 31st year teaching constitutional law. And I'm certain that many people who I know, who are conservatives and who are still associated with the Republican Party and so forth, if I asked them 10 years ago, would you accept the positions that they are today accepting, they would absolutely have said no. And there is something in our nature that allows for incremental adjustments in the way we think about things that then become part of our core identity, and it becomes extraordinarily difficult to displace that sense of core identity, right? And we're experiencing this, and I really think it's important for members of our community not to be Pollyannish about where we are, because it's pretty serious. Yeah.
Let's take a few questions.
Hey, Sandy.
This is a question both for you, Max, and for the rabbi. If I heard you correctly, you said that it was the Haredi Orthodox community that was supportive with the evangelicals of what the court has done. But I also believe the Orthodox Union supports the change in the Establishment Clause. So I think it is, if not universal, it isn't just the black hats, if I may use that expression, in the Orthodox community. It's overwhelmingly the organized Orthodox community that is on the side of the evangelicals with regard to the Establishment Clause.
I'm going to defer to the rabbi on that one. What you're saying doesn't surprise me, but I'll confess this gets closer to your expertise than mine, obviously.
I'm not entirely sure on that issue either. I mean, obviously, Yeshiva University is the flagship, quote-unquote, modern Orthodox institution, right? So it's not a Haredi institution. It has been tracking further and further to the right, and in that sense, I do think it has become more and more sympathetic to the kinds of thinking about religion and state relationships that are there in, for example, Catholic evangelical circles. How widespread acceptance of these new or different approaches are within Orthodoxy, I don't know. Are these rabbis? Are these regular Jews in the pews? I'm sure at Ner Israel they're dancing the hora, right? But as a Haredi rabbi once said to me, this is Planet Baltimore when it comes to the ultra-Orthodox establishment here. So I also don't know how widespread it is. It will be interesting to find out, especially since Orthodoxy is, in some ways, the most successful movement in America right now, Jewish movement in America. They're not the largest by far. I don't anticipate them becoming the largest, but they certainly are not shrinking like other movements seem to be.
Hi, this is a question for Professor Stearns. Because of concerns about how the Supreme Court seems to have become essentially a tool of the Republican movement, there have been a number of proposals for packing the court, limiting terms, only allowing one administration to pick 2 justices. I'd be curious on your thoughts about any reforms that could be made to the court.
Yes, well, thank you for that question. So the 2 most popular proposals are the proposals that you've mentioned, right? Court packing has an interesting history. FDR wanted to do it. There's mixed historical claims about whether, in fact, Owen Roberts, an earlier Justice Roberts, by changing a position in a case actually involving minimum wage laws for women, was the switch in time that saved 9. And that kind of took the wind out of the sails of that court packing plan. People seem to think that Moses, in addition to the 10 commandments that he was carrying, that there was an 11th that said, thou shalt have 9 justices when there's a United States Supreme Court. But actually, it's not etched either in stone or in the Constitution. Congress could change the number of justices by statute. So that could be done. But there's just this long-standing tradition of a 9. It's sometimes been higher, sometimes been lower, but we've had 9 for a very long time. I don't think court packing is a likely plan. I do think that the 18-year term limit is, you would have to amend the Constitution because justices have life tenure under Article 3. That is not one of my proposals, actually, but I do talk about it in the book and actually say, once we fix our democracy, here's some other things that we might want to do, and I actually talk about that. And I will say I've come around on it. I used to actually not be a fan of the idea of term-limited Supreme Court justices. I'm becoming more of a fan of the idea. But that gets into some more complicated stories. But I think that neither of them are really likely unless and until we actually have a functioning democracy. Because honestly, there's a lot of power there. And it's, and one of the things people need to realize is we call ourselves a republic. A lot of people say we're a democracy, but we are profoundly anti-democratic in many significant ways. The Senate as maybe the showcase of an anti-democratic institution. If you look, for example, at the simple fact that Wyoming and California have an equal-sized delegation, despite the fact that California's population is 66 times, that, right? So 66 times that of Wyoming. So just one example, and of course the Electoral College. So in any event, I think these are really worthwhile and thoughtful ideas, and I'm glad they're being talked about.
Larry.
I infer from your comments that you think that this threat to democracy also is a threat to American Judaism. I don't want to put words into your mouth.
I do.
I do. Yes.
For sure.
And I also. And if that is the case, and I realize this other loaded part of my question is a bit controversial, I am struck by the number of Jewish donors who are very forward-speaking in their support of Israel, but are also donors to the people who are at the forefront of the threat to democracy. One way of defining that might be the people who voted against certifying Biden's election. And yet organizations such as AIPAC have contributed to those people. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this view about what may be good for Israel being potentially different than what may be good for Jews in America who have always relied on this pluralistic democracy.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I'll make a couple of observations, and I'm fairly certain that in doing so I will not entirely answer your question, but I will make a couple of observations. So the one sentence that I kept thinking, does it stay in my talk or come out of my talk, was the one about the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And I ultimately decided to keep it in there, hoping that there'd be a question that would allow me to explain why I put it there. I want to be clear, you know, Jews were divided over that. And my own view on that was that this was a signal to a community of Jews. It was making good on a campaign promise, just like appointing justices that would overturn Roe v. Wade, making good on a campaign promise. But in terms of policy, I think the reason why no president before recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is because it's a bargaining chip that could really be useful if you're trying to negotiate a solution to what's going on in Israel. And to give it away with nothing in return is to, and I'm not a politician, obviously, but that's just a striking thing to me, right? To have a campaign promise fulfilled at the price of giving away something that actually matters, it's symbolic but also real, right? Could have actually been used as leverage for something that really could have produced something of value benefiting Palestinians and Jews in the long term. And there's a kind of myopia there, in my view. I don't know. Maybe I'll leave that as my couple of observations and turn it over to the rabbi.
I think we have time for one more question. Alan, please.
Question is, I'd like to make a statement and just ask you to comment on that. A lot of people think that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, if she had moved out while Obama was still president, Obama would have had one more pick, and that the three justices that Trump picked were really not truthful with their answers, and that impeaching them is very difficult at this time. So we have the Dobbs case, and now it's going to be up to the 50 states to make decisions on abortion. And maybe that's what our democracy is about, and why we have all these states, that they can each make their decisions, and there'll be big divisions there. Then there's the talk of that Congress, Schumer is saying that he may want to pass federal legislation which would approve abortion, and I don't know whether that's constitutional or not, and whether that would ever pass because of the possibility of a filibuster. So I just wonder if you can make comments on all that.
Yeah, so I'm going to divide your question to what I'm going to call the Ruth Bader Ginsburg question and the Susan Collins question, if I may. And they're related. So I'm one of the people, I'll confess, who kept thinking, retire, right? Just step off the court. Do it early, step off the court, be replaced. And I want to say, I don't want to take anything away from the high esteem that many people hold of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There are reasons why people hold her in such high esteem. I share much of that esteem. But people are human. And one of the things that she said that I found problematic was, well, who would you replace me, who would be better to replace me with? And the answer, of course, was somebody 40 years younger, frankly. That was the answer, right? Somebody who's that much younger and also in good health, which you aren't. But she made a mistake, and it was a costly mistake, and it's an ironic mistake in the sense that it actually cost her her legacy to have made that mistake. The very thing that was front and center in her jurisprudence is the thing that we are paying the price for as a result of her having made that mistake. And I also kept thinking, Justice Breyer, you've experienced this, what's going on? Finally, yes, right? So you know, and that's how we have Ketanji Brown Jackson, which she did an impressive job at oral argument yesterday, by the way, if anybody was listening. The Susan Collins question. So Susan Collins presented that she was lied to about the question of abortion. Now, I wasn't in the room with Kavanaugh and Collins or any of the other justices in Collins. But I know one thing. These justices, I may or may not agree with their view of the world, but I know they're smart. And I know that they never said, we will never overturn Roe v. Wade. They are too smart to have said that. I believe what they said was, it is a super precedent. We value precedent. I would be shocked beyond compare if they literally lied to her. And I think that she had an obligation to understand what she was being told. I actually published in my blog an open letter to Susan Collins on the Kavanaugh appointment. I just mentioned that after the whole thing went down. But I will say, you know, we need to understand these nominees know how to dance the dance. You know, Arlen Specter back in the day said, it's a dance. We ask, and the strange thing about Supreme Court confirmation hearings is, you never get to actually ask the question to which you want the answer, and you never get the answer that's direct. Everybody knows it's a show. And everything has to be understood as if you're watching a very stylized form of entertainment, because that's all it is. And unfortunately, people make statements in those contexts. Like, for example, Roberts saying, I'm the umpire calling balls and strikes. That's so obviously utterly bogus, right? The idea that the Supreme Court is not in these areas in which it's not clear what the rule is, actually making law, no, not the umpire calling balls and strikes. But this is such a part of our culture that when Sotomayor was up at her confirmation hearing, she had to retract a speech she gave at Duke Law School, which was the most uncontroversial proposition imaginable. She said, you all ought to know that courts of appeals, the intermediate courts between the trial courts, the federal district courts and the Supreme Court, they're making a lot of law in their interpretation of statutes in the Constitution. And then she goes up on nomination and she basically rescinds that comment and says, oh no, we call balls and strikes. I don't think that we are better off as a country for having an uneducated electorate. I just don't. I think we can live in the real world and people can really understand the Supreme Court makes a lot of law. So do lower courts. I think we can live with reality. I don't think we have to be so naive that we have to pretend things aren't true in order to become confirmed. I actually regret that I think she would have gotten confirmed anyways. I think it was a mistake. I think she should have said, you know what I said is right, and here's why. It would have been a great moment, because we would have actually had people say, you know what, okay, now I have a better sense of what the courts do. Because if people think that the Supreme Court's calling balls and strikes, that's not helping. That's not helping us become a better democracy. It's helping us have a mythological view of what our separation of powers systems looks like that bears no resemblance to what it actually looks like.
Well, I want to take that charge from you that to be a more educated populace in addition to a more educated and hopefully not juristocracy. And that is to each of us that we should continue to learn and pay attention to these issues. These are not ancillary, they're not irrelevant to our Jewish lives, our religious lives. I actually think the thriving of the Jewish community in this country is largely dependent on the protections that we've been afforded by our democracy, imperfect though it is. And so if we believe that this is a place that we want to continue to make a home, it really falls to us to continue to educate ourselves, to understand how we can build power and how we can make changes as necessary. So I thank you, Max, for putting some of these issues front and center for us today. I want to give folks a little bit of time to stretch their legs before Mincha for those who are staying. Mincha will be at 5 o'clock right here on the Bima with teens reading from the book of Jonah. And once again, Yasher Koach, and thank you to Max.
Thank you all very much.